Thank you very much. I first wanted to thank the organizers for the impeccable work that they have done in organizing this event, and also to Ms. Ershadi for the translation, the wonderful translation that she has produced out of this very originally difficult multidisciplinary article, which now has become a book. I would like to follow up on what the director of the British Museum was saying a short while ago in the film, when talking about the Americans being seen through the eyes of the Soviets. And I will start by quoting Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who stated, and I quote him, "Europe is the source, the unique source of the ideas of individual liberty, political democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and cultural freedom. These are European ideas, not Asian, not African, nor African, nor Middle Eastern ideas, except by adoption." This assertion of such an eminent thinker of the 20th century illustrates the fact that to date, in the Western legal, philosophical, and political literature, the established viewpoint has consisted of considering the ideas that were shaped around the 508 BCE Athenian democracy as the origins of human rights. It is true that despite the vicissitudes of history, the ideas that germinated in the minds of distinguished thinkers such as Aristotle, Socrates, or Plato journeyed through millennia and profoundly influenced the Age of Enlightenment. These resulted in a series of declarations and charters of human rights, which were generally brought into life in the 17th to the 18th centuries. We could mention here the habeas corpus from 1679, the Bill of Rights from 1689, the American Constitution of 1787, and its first 10 amendments of 1791, but also the French Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen of 1789. This presentation does not seek to question these achievements. Instead, this presentation seeks to illustrate a certain paradox that exists among those who claim that human rights are universal, the universalists. Accordingly, some universalists maintain that, on the one hand, human rights should be applied by all members of the international community, but on the other hand, they see the values that they consider universal as an exclusive emanation of one selected civilization, that is, the civilization linking itself to the values of the Athenian democracy. In other words, these universalists are universalists insofar as, to the extent only that the application of human rights are concerned, but when it comes to the sources of human rights, they remain profoundly relativist. Hence the misperception that universalists use human rights tools in order to promote values that are intrinsic to their own civilization. Reality, however, is more complex, and it is like a prism that offers a multitude of facets, with each of them representing one aspect of the truth of the whole. Accordingly, this presentation aims to focus on another facet of the prism in relation to the origin of human rights. Under what is proposed today, the Athenian democracy should be viewed only as one component of egalitarian aspirations that existed in the ancient world. Thus, while modern democracy and human rights are complementary to each other, it is important to see how human rights, 30 years before the official birth of democracy in Athens, were conceptualized by a ruler, a king, that is Cyrus, in his proclamation. Now I would like to first start with the principles that are contained in the cylinder, in the proclamation that is in the cylinder that you have just seen on the, I think you can see here, that's the cylinder. To better understand this, it is important to realize two things, two events that took place simultaneously about 26, 27, 28 centuries ago. On the one hand, it is the destruction of the Hebrews, of the Jews, as a organized structure. These happened in the 8th and 7th centuries before this era, so 28, 29 centuries ago, by two successive invasions. First by the Assyrians, and then who deported many Jews from where they lived, and then the Babylonians, who destroyed the temple, which came to be known as the first temple, the temple that was built at the time of kings David and Solomon. So that's one event. The other event, totally unrelated, is so on the one hand is the demise of Jews as an organized society. On the other hand is the rise of Iranians as an organized society. Totally unrelated to each other, but through Cyrus we will see how they come together. And that's simply the migration of Iranians from Central Asia southwards in the second millennium, 4,000 years ago essentially. And the creation of the land, the naming of a land as Iran. Now, in the construction of the society, Iranians were led by Persians, and among them there was a king whose name was Cyrus. One of the major conquests of Cyrus in the creation of the empire was the conquest of Babylon. And it is at the time where Cyrus conquers Babylon that he issues his proclamation, which follows a tradition that had lasted for 3,000 years. That kings upon the conquest of a city or of a kingdom, emperors, would issue a proclamation. And in this proclamation, Cyrus relates how he conquered Babylon, which is not so interesting for the purpose of this presentation, but essentially what he did during and after his conquest. By reading the proclamation, the text of the proclamation, we realize that it has got a pragmatic purpose. It doesn't have any theoretical formulation of thoughts and ideas. It's just about an event, about Babylon. But whilst it doesn't contain any traces of theory, it is, however, possible to identify theoretical principles which foreshadow the core principles and values of present-day human rights. For example, as embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as you mentioned earlier. So we can distinguish a number of values, a number of acts that Cyrus is the originator, which we find the equivalent in a more theoretical manner in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first set of these acts, of these principles, is that the principle of the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which can be read in parallel with Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, on the right of freedom, the conscience, and religion, including the right to change one's religion, belief, etc., and to worship in public or private. There are passages in the proclamation that attest to this. Throughout, actually, the proclamation, Cyrus pays homage to the king of, to the god of gods of Babylon, Marduk, and he constantly says, for example, Cyrus, the king who worships Marduk, by the grace of Marduk I arrived. So, regardless of what the religion of Cyrus was, if any, and in what kind of god he believed, again, if any, in those days people tended to be polytheistic rather than monotheistic. What is important is that even if he doesn't believe in Marduk, the god of Babylonians, he does pay homage, respect to the god of those who he has conquered. Another principle that we find in, that we can single out from the proclamation itself is the protection of civilians, essentially the non-military population. This can be divided into the way the combatants, the army of Cyrus behaved in the conquered lands of Babylon, the right to liberty and security, and finally the return of the displaced person. When it comes to the behavior of combatants, Cyrus says in the proclamation that his numerous troops walked around in Babylon in peace, and that Cyrus, I quote, did not allow anybody to terrorize any place. These are just passages I'm quoting from the proclamation. It is important to realize that by adopting this type of, for today it seems normal, you would say, but it's normal, you know, there are the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, humanitarian law that regulate the behavior of combatants during armed conflicts. But in those days, this was quite a new thing. I'm not saying that he's the only one to have done that. I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer, but from what I read through this proclamation, I can say that, for example, the two sentences that I cited do accord with today's principles of humanitarian law. And this was a big risk, we should realize, because at a time where strength and superiority had to be proven by shattering one's enemy into submission, Cyrus decides to take the risk of appearing as being a bit soft and is sort of a weakening. And by defying this cult of virility, it's almost anti-masculine what he did for his time, he took the risk of being perceived by humans as a weak person, but also by gods, because people believed in gods in those days, as someone who may not deserve to be a king, a ruler, someone who manages an environment. As I said, this is reminiscent of the humanitarian law principles and norms of the 20th and 21st century, but also Article 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then comes the right to what I call the right to liberty and security. I will read a sentence from the proclamation and I will explain what I mean by that. Cyrus says that, and I quote, "As for the citizens of Babylon, whom the former king, the one he deposed, had made subservient in a manner totally unsuited to them against the will of the gods, I released them from their weariness and loosened their burden." This passage is to be read in accordance with another passage in which which reads, "Daily the former king brought all his people to ruin by imposing toils without rest." The word subservient means slavishly submissive, obsequious, and as for the word toil in the dictionary, it means severe labor, hard and continuous work, or exertion, which taxes the body or mental powers. So what we see here is that Cyrus tried to relieve the citizens of Babylon from the pressure under which to which they were subjected. We are not saying here that there was slavery or he abolished slavery, but at the minimum what he did was to relieve them from that sort of treatment. And this can be read in parallel with Article 3 of the Universal, again, Declaration of Human Rights of 65 years ago, which is on the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. This prohibition, this type of prohibition is also criminalized in the statute of the International Criminal Court. And we should also realize that regardless of to what extent Cyrus dealt with the issue of slavery, I personally don't think he eliminated that, but he must have limited it. It is still a novel approach for his time, where, as we know, slavery and toils and exploitation was a fact that was accepted and not questioned later in the Athenian democracy. Even we know that Aristotle has a whole passage in his treatise on slavery and how a slave is a property of his overmaster. The other issue is the last major principle under this protection of civilians is the return of displaced persons. A few passages in the proclamation can be found where, for example, Cyrus says that he also gathered all the former inhabitants of the lands and returned to them their habitations. And elsewhere he says that how he had them to return to their habitations. There were many people who had been displaced by wars, and Cyrus did contribute to their return. This is attested in the Hebrew Bible, which I will come back later. The third and last major principle that we can single out from the proclamation is the protection of property. This one I would divide into two parts. The protection of private property, which is what we each own. Today it would be your car or pen or my watch. And the other one is the protection of public property in the form of cultural heritage. And in terms of public property, Cyrus does say in the proclamation that he brought relief to the dilapidated housing of the citizens of Babylon, and he then explains how he let them take possession again of what had been confiscated. This cannot be read in parallel with Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Men's Rights on the right to own property. On the cultural or spiritual heritage, there are two key passages in the proclamation where Cyrus announces that he returned to the sanctuaries which had been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. Images here is reference to the images of gods. And he also says, that the other passage, all gods are settled in a peaceful place. So one of the measures taken by Cyrus in order to rectify the situation was to return the sacred items to their sanctuaries and bring that pillage to an end, which had taken place under the former king. This is the cultural heritage. This is what today we call, in, of course, anthropology, definitely, and sociology, but also international law, public cultural heritage or cultural property. Museums, the Statue of Liberty, for example, is part of cultural property. It is what shapes a society, what gives to a civilization its meaning. So Cyrus contributes to restoring or repairing that cultural property. Now, it could be said that the proclamation, many have said, the critics have said, that the proclamation is a mere instrument of propaganda. He was a king, an emperor, he conquered the country, lands, countries, and to justify what he did, he issued this cylinder, which is mere propaganda, sheer propaganda. That's an interesting way of questioning the proclamation. So, as a matter of curiosity, I tried to look into for historical evidence that would either go against or that would corroborate what Cyrus says. Interestingly enough, I could find, and historians also cannot find anything that goes against what Cyrus says. On the contrary, there are two major sources, contemporaneous, that attest to the veracity of what Cyrus says. On the one hand, the friends of the Persians, of the Iranians, Jews. On the other hand, the enemies, the Greeks. The Hebrew Bible is actually a number of books that constitute the Hebrew Bible, essentially the books of Isaiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Second Chronicles abound in terms of passages that confirm what Cyrus claims to have done through his proclamation. interestingly enough, these books refer also to a proclamation that was issued by Cyrus. I will give you some examples. In several passages, Yahweh speaks very highly of Cyrus, and he calls him his shepherd who shall perform all his pleasures. But he also, there is a passage in the book of Isaiah which says, "Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid." This is when Yahweh is communicating with Cyrus on the building of the temple. As I said earlier, the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. So what Cyrus does, and there are ample, long passages in the book of Ezra in particular, that explain how Cyrus not only ordered the reconstruction of the temple, but also enabled Jews who had been in captivity for over a century in Babylonia, to return to their promised land and to rebuild the temple. As an anecdote, the temple's construction began then, and it was finished under Darius, another king that would come after Cyrus. And another anecdote, a few centuries later, the temple will again be destroyed, this time by Romans. So this time by the Europeans, not by the Persians, not by the Iranians, ever. And there is a lot of evidence, again, in the Hebrew Bible, to the extent that Cyrus enabled not only Jews to return to the Promised Land, but also he gave them back their belongings that had been confiscated at the time of the Babylonians and Assyrians. And a number of Jewish historians have opined that by favoring the return of these 50,000 plus Jews to Jerusalem, Cyrus actually is the one who initiated what is called the return to Zion. So it was a Persian king. Greeks were throughout the 200 years of this first Persian Empire's existence at war with the Persians. Persia was a mega empire, the first major empire of its time, that stretched from the Indus Valley, somewhere between Pakistan and India today, to Egypt, to Libya, and to the small parts of today's Europe, to the Caucasus and Central Asia. And Persia was facing a small group of city-states that today we know as Greece, and they were fighting. So the Greeks portrayed, quite naturally, a very negative image of Persians by explaining that these were like major monsters, these Asian hordes who were coming there to attack the values of small but very smart and refined Europe. These are repeating themselves in history, as we all know, and they never end, it seems, sadly. But what is interesting is that the Greeks, who were these enemies, all major Greek thinkers, when it comes to Cyrus, have expressed very positive opinions about Cyrus's deeds. Herodotus, in his histories, the father of historiography, Herodotus, describes Cyrus as a father who, in relation to his subject, I quote, was merciful and always worked for their well-being. Pausanias, another Greek thinker, in his description of Greece, also refers to Cyrus as the father of men. And maybe one small passage I would like to quote from Plato, 100 years after the death of Cyrus, reads as follows. I'll try to shorten it. The Persians under Cyrus maintained a due balance between slavery and freedom. They became, first of all, free themselves, and after that, masters of many others. For when the rulers gave a share of freedom to their subjects and advanced them to a position of equality, the soldiers were more friendly towards their officers. It's very simple principles. And if there was any wise man amongst them, able to give counsel, since the king was not jealous, but allowed free speech, and respected those who could help at all by their counsel, such a man had the opportunity of contributing to the common stock, the fruit of his wisdom. Consequently, at that time, all their affairs made progress, owing to their freedom, friendliness, and mutual interchange of reason. In the Cyropedia, Xenophon also refers to Cyrus as the model of this ideal upbringing. And we know that Jefferson had Cyrus as a model, and he had a number of copies of the Cyropedia on him, with him. He was influenced by Cyrus's ideas. And finally, in his play, The Persian, Aeschylus, who really portrays negatively the Persians, when it comes, however, to Cyrus, says, Cyrus, blessed with a lucky destiny, secured peace for all who were his friends. God hated him not, for he was a man of great understanding. So, from Jews who called Cyrus, because it's in the books, the Messiah. So the Jews, Cyrus was the Messiah, and you can find that in various books that I cited before. To Greeks, who called him a father, compassionate person, we can conclude that what is contained in the proclamation has been corroborated contemporaneously to the proclamation, more or less, by these sources and many other sources. So, as I said before, the proclamation does not encompass normative abstractions. But its content permits to single out a general set of rights for the citizens that were granted by an emperor. Cyrus granted these rights, and what's interesting, when he was at the height of his power. No revolution had forced him to concede them, those rights, as a compromise to save his reign, as it happens often in history. Nor was his empire being broken up, faced with riots, that would have urged him to grant those rights to save whatever could be saved. Nor finally was he threatened by an oligarchy that could, as in all the systems, like in England, that have evolved towards a parliamentarian system, for the king to make concessions. Actually, Cyrus granted his rights when he was really powerful, when we could say cynically today, at a time when he didn't have to make those concessions. There was no need for him to make concessions. These rights that he granted constitute some of the core human rights principles that are contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the paradox is that by granting these rights, the emperor, that's old terminology, today we would say the president or the king or something, or the state, if you will, the government, the administration, by granting those rights, limited its own powers. And that is one of the original aspects of Cyrus's deeds. Cyrus must have been influenced by some thinking, because one may say, well, why did he do it? Was he really forced to issue these? I believe that Cyrus was, but that's another debate, was to a certain extent influenced by the ideas, the philosophy of a great philosopher, prophet of Iran, whose name was Zarathustra, who came a little bit before Cyrus. And it is true that every passage of the proclamation makes reference to metaphysical names, deities, gods, but this is normal for the time of Cyrus. But when we contextualize this, we can say that the mere respect that he paid to gods who were not his gods already is a manifestation of his tolerance. I would add a caveat here, which is that Cyrus should not be treated as a godlike figure. This is not my intention. He was primarily, let us not forget, a conqueror, an emperor. But he was a new type of ruler for his time. We are talking about nearly 26 centuries ago. We are not talking about today. Not forgetting that today, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, or various other proclamations, declarations, and conventions that militate in favor of human rights were only issued from the mid-19th century to date. Here we're talking about 26 centuries ago, nearly. He was a sort of an exceptional ruler, and it could be maintained that the clement policy of Cyrus towards the Jews may have been justified by the fact that the return to Jerusalem would have enabled him to have allies for the conquest of Egypt that he was beginning to conceptualize. It is equally true that Cyrus may have needed the Mesopotamian Babylonian clergy's help to help him actually conquer Babylon. That is equally true. We could even say that he may have had to make these promises to the inhabitants of the conquered regions in order to strengthen his power. We know that the conquest of Babylon was relatively done with not major bloodshed. But having said all these, I believe that in those millennia where no globally shared moral standards existed, nothing would have prevented Cyrus from betraying his promises once he had established his power, which was the greatest power of his time. We know that Cyrus rejected the cruel practices of the surrounding empires, practices which consisted systematically of, and these are available in history, it's evidenced in archaeology, which consisted of usually destroying the cities, enslaving children, men, women, raping women, and selling them, and enslaving the children, for example. These were regularly practiced. But Cyrus chose not to follow that path. Unlike Alexander, who I call the Macedonian, not the great necessarily, it depends on from which angle we look at him. Unlike Alexander, whose Hellenization consists of naming cities after himself. How many Alexandrias have existed? Egypt, the whole of North Africa, wherever he went, everything was called Alexandria. Where the Greek language was imposed on the populations, Cyrus and his whole dynasty did not impose their language, the Persian language, let's say, which was the dynastic language, on the conquered populations. It seems that Cyrus and his successors had in mind something which today we would call a federal state, like in this country, where you have a central government, but most of the other powers are delegated to the states that constitute the federation. This is what he did, of course, in the context of an empire, but we didn't have anything but kingdoms and monarchies and empires in those days. So that's what he tried to do. Consciously, subconsciously, I don't know, but he did it. In fact, he remained faithful to his principles even after he conquered those lands. Had he betrayed those principles, his memory would not have been engraved with such profound humanity among the people known to him, be it those who were subdued by him or those who were liberated by him. There is no reason why Greeks, 600 years after the death of Cyrus, would have still talked of him in good terms. They may have been nice to him at a time when he was powerful because they feared him. But 600 years later, or even 300 years later, when the first Persian Empire has disappeared, when Greeks were ruling today's Iran, Persia, in those days they had no obligation to write positively, to say positive things about Cyrus. He his magnanimity is, Cyrus's, is illustrated in particular at the very end of the Hebrew Bible, in the 2nd Chronicles. This is the end, this is the way the Hebrew Bible ends. It's just the end, and I would like to read it for you. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, saying, Thus said Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me. And he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. This is an Iranian king saying it. Let us not forget that. Which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Here ends the Hebrew Bible. As observed by David Ben-Gurion, a special privilege this, to be accorded to a ruler who was not a Jew, to close the book of books, and to close it with a word that in our day, this is 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, as well has a faithful meaning. The Hebrew word that says, let him go up. So many positive accounts from so many different sources, stretching from antiquity to modern days. Some friends, some foes, can only corroborate the fact that the proclamation of Cyrus is an august outcome of a ruler's, i.e. Cyrus, perception of a thinker's, Zarathustra, ideas. In fact, I believe that the deeds of Cyrus were an outcome of the ancient world's egalitarian movements. He should not be credited. Cyrus is just an individual. No leader should ever be credited. She comes from the movements of his time over time. So did Cyrus. These movements had been struggling to materialize, and Cyrus appeared to be there, and they materialized through him, these egalitarian aspirations. In this regard, it may be safely said that the proclamation is a precursor or constitutes an early form of human rights declaration. It's not necessarily the first, but it's an early form, granted by a ruler, by an emperor. Sadly, and I'm about to finish, most of what the broader education offers us today is about the search of power for the sake of power. The epics of the Caesars, the Genghis Khans, the Tamerlanes, and the Napoleons. If Alexander's greatness is studied, we all know, how is it possible not to know Alexander the Great? It is because of the West's fascination induced by Alexander's expansionism, thereby opening the doors of curiosity to subdued lands, as if all those Oriental lands had to do after millennia of civilization before Alexander was to await their exoticism to be explored by that European conqueror. In contrast, education offers virtually no space to the kinds of Cyrus's humanist messages, perhaps out of ignorance, maybe because of a lack of interest, or a combination of both, I think personally. Therefore, a major goal of human rights education should consist of rectifying this heavily prejudiced idea that other cultures cannot develop human rights, but if they do, it is only through the sporadic initiatives of an autochthonous elite whose exposure to the values of Athenian democracy in the West, combined with their exceptional cerebral predisposition to comprehend them, enable these societies to transcend their torpid state of existence. This is wrong. If this type of apprehension is not corrected, this type of assessment will always lead to the misunderstanding that those other civilizations systematically need the advice of a moral set of counselors as part of a civilizing mission, as if their citizens had a congenital inability to perceive human rights. This is wrong, we know. Therefore, human rights education should take account of other civilizations' experiences of egalitarian conceptions. No doubt that both the Athenian democracy and the proclamation of Cyrus would then prove to be only 2 drops in the vast ocean of human rights aspirations. Only then, and really only then, I believe, could the ambiguity surrounding the universality of human rights be removed. Thank you very much.
Mr. ابطحی, thank you very much for that insightful and very informative lecture. I would like to open the floor for any question if you guys might have for Mr. ابطحی. No question. Dr. Nizam, I invite you to close this lecture.
The proclamation, was that what's written on the Cyrus cylinder, or what is the conception?
Yes, absolutely. The proclamation is written on the cylinder.
It's like made of clay, or?
Yes, it's made of clay, and
So it's just written all?
yes, it's in the cuneiform alphabet, and that's just a text that narrates what happened.
And is this the only format in which King Cyrus had, information or proclamations made with regard to human rights? Is this the only place?
That's the only proclamation that that has been found so far. Bits and pieces of what seems to be copies of this proclamation have also been more recently rediscovered, actually. They haven't been discovered, they have been rediscovered. He seems to have issued a number of these, but they seem to be all the same proclamation. Like it's one proclamation that was, the replicas of which were in the different places in the empire.
And was it mostly just really a recitation of what he did in the
Yes.
Babylon?
Yes, it's exactly how he comes to conquer Babylon. It's made of 3 parts. The first 2 parts are the third person singular. Somebody is explaining what's happening, and then it's like a movie actually. And then the third part is Cyrus himself speaking to us. So first it's the god Marduk and others that are explaining what happened. Essentially, it explains, it's the justification, if you will, of the conquerors of Babylon by Cyrus. And then the third part is what he says to have done to the Babylonians since the conquest of Babylon. And it's this third part that contains the magnanimous measures that Cyrus announces, which are very pragmatic, but as I explained, one could turn them into more abstract proposals, human rights proposals.
Is this cylinder, thank you so much, is the cylinder that is being exhibited now here, is it the original one or is it the replica?
No, the one which is at the Getty Museum right now, and I invite everyone to go there if you haven't been. It's very interesting to see. It's this big. That's the original. The replica in the 70s, in the 1970s, a replica was sent to the United Nations, and it is still there. It was the then government of Iran that managed to send that replica there. Now, a new replica is being placed at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So all governments have been working on this.
Another question I have, if the proclamation of Cyrus is a reflection of a happy and successful society, why couldn't the declaration continue with the other dynasties in 2,500 years?
It actually did, but my focus was on the cylinder. But I'm glad that you asked this question. In fact, throughout this was the first Iranian dynasty, the Achaemenians, and then we have the two other dynasties that will rule Persia, Iran for 1,000 years, and they will be the main foes of the Roman Empire. I didn't cite, actually I have it here, but a lot, this tolerance continued. A few examples that I gladly share with you are, it's going to be more maybe centered on the Jewish culture. For example, we know that there is the Talmud of Babylon that still today regulates the private essential life of Jews, of Judaism. There used to be two Talmuds. There was the Talmud of Jerusalem and the Talmud of Babylon. The Talmud of Babylon was written when Babylon was under Persian rule, under the Sasanians. And the whole big chunks of the Old Testament were written also under Persian kings. And there are many other examples, including with the Greeks, for example, the rebuilding of temples in Magnesia, Meander, in what was then Greece, which took in today's Eurasia. And this continued, actually. It was not just a proclamation, but I am not aware of any other proclamation as such to have been issued. It just continued, the spirit of tolerance. Yes, in a country that has got 28 centuries of statehood, it is one of the oldest statehoods. I'm not talking about civilization, but statehood. Of course, there are ups and downs. One could always point at dark eras, of course, but we have it also for countries that have been around only for 150 years or 200 years or 300 years. But if we make abstraction of those downs, there were a lot of ups actually, a lot of positives in that time. I'm not idealizing. I'm just saying that it's made of both. But the good did not altogether disappear. We just are not often aware of how that good manifested itself.
Another question? I'd like to mention that USC Bookstore has few copy of his book, and he kindly agreed to sign it. If you would like to have a book signing after.
I want to personally express my gratitude to Mr. ابطحی, to Dr. Shalapur, and to Shirin Jan for allowing us to host this event, to have the privilege of listening to Mr. ابطحی. It was so intriguing to see the way you're passionate about the topic. As you were talking, it was coming from your heart, besides being a scholar in the area. So on behalf of the Masters of Science of Global Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine, we would like to present you with a certificate of appreciation. We're ready for the book signing. We have coffee, tea, drinks, and Persian sweets. And there would be an opportunity also in an informal venue to be able to talk to Mr. ابطحی.